I'm sure that if you're an intellectually curious person, you've wanted to know the answers to questions like, how did life begin? What is consciousness? Why does the universe appear the way that it does? To our ancestors, the simple explanation of gods or goddesses, I included goddesses, not to be sexist, don't worry, as forces of nature was satisfactory. Eventually, science became our way of understanding the world around us. To many, the purpose of science is to figure out not only how the universe works, but why it exists. When we think of science or mathematics, typically we think that theories are verified or unverified by a rigorous process. Unlike literature or philosophy, for example, where different interpretations can be argued about forever. Is science purely no-nonsense and rigorous? Or are there theories that can be argued about forever? What are the limits of science? Does science have a lifespan? And if so, when will it end? The idea that science may come to an end may sound absurd. If there are limits to science, which of course there are, it may come sooner than we think, considering how fast it's accelerating. Physicists may continue to smash particles together with more intensity, and astronomers may look farther out into the universe. However, science will inevitably confront physical, economic, and even cognitive limits. Consciousness remains a mystery because it's so subjective. Thankfully, it's likely that problems like climate change and renewable energy will be solved before then. Well, I sure hope so. It is predicted that we would be a bunch of hedonists into a virtual reality. And although we aren't quite a new Polynesia, although it looks like we're getting there more and more all the time, we can see that science is beginning to have a diminish in returns. Most of physical reality and the forces that govern it have been mapped out. Horgan argues that because science has already discovered so much, it's not likely that the discoveries of the future will be as significant as, say, Darwin or Einstein. In other words, we won't find anything that surprises us. The application of science will continue. Superior computers, hopefully ones where Adobe Media Encoder will actually fucking work, gene editing to make us healthier, and renewable energy. If the application of science is going to continue, what would constitute a surprise? A few examples would be astronomers noticing that the universe is expanding and evolving, Einstein discovering that massive objects cause a warping of space and time, and quantum mechanics unveiling a probabilistic element of reality. Although Einstein would argue that God does not play dice. Discovery of life outside our planet would be significant for obvious reasons. Let me know in the comments if you think a video on alien life would be interesting in the future. Traveling to other planets ourselves would be really impractical. If we wanted to visit our closest neighbor, Alpha Centauri, that would take a spaceship, even at 1,000,000 miles an hour, a 3,000-year trip, about the duration of a bad DMT trip. Immortality would be a surprise, but there's still a debate as to whether or not this is possible to even achieve. An objection to this idea that pure science is ending is that this is what scientists thought at the end of the 19th century, only for relativity and quantum mechanics to emerge in the 20th. Therefore, anyone to make a prediction like this is as short-sighted as the scientists at the end of the 19th century. No one wants to appear short-sighted. Saying that science will end could also be a self-fulfilling prophecy. According to Bentley Glass, biologist and president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, quote, "We are like the explorers of a great continent who have penetrated to its margins and most points of the compass and have mapped the major mountain chains and rivers. There are still innumerable details to fill in, but the endless horizons no longer exist," end quote. Speaking pragmatically, science also has the financial constraint as an enterprise. Why would we be spending billions of dollars finding smaller and smaller particles when the same could be spent curing diseases such as cancer or AIDS? Experiments in particle physics have merely confirmed previous theories and haven't revealed any new phenomena. Quote, "There are going to be new additions to the structure of knowledge, but we have made some of the biggest possible advances. and it's just a question of whether there are any more really big changes in our conceptual universe that are going to be made. Darwin is whom we credit the discovery of evolution to. He noticed that creatures who adapt to the environment around them are more likely to survive, passing their traits to their offspring. Coincidentally, he was also doing this work around the same time that Mendel discovered genes, which confirmed Darwin's theories. There exists a hardcore reductionist who uses Darwinism to obliterate anyone who contradicts his materialist worldview, and happens to be one of the big four atheists. Take a fair guess. I'm of course talking about Richard Dawkins. Dawkins doesn't believe that religion and science can coexist, or treated as separate fields, because religion claims that a god or goddess, or gaping vaginas, created the universe because, quote, all purpose comes from natural selection. Though we did all emerge from a gaping vagina, so I guess that is scientifically accurate. Except for me, of course, because I was a C-section. I guess that makes Dawkins a firm believer in the gaping vagina creation myth. Speaking of memes, Dawkins is credited with this idea. The idea of memes, which in itself is a meme, is evolutionary theory applied to ideas. It isn't enough to say, hey, believe my stupid idea or watch my stupid YouTube video because I say so, and I'm so amazing. Ideas spread because they are compelling. In the example of religion given, it is compelling to believe that if you don't subscribe to this belief system, that you will go to hell. And if you do subscribe to it, you will be rewarded for eternity in heaven. This all makes sense so far. Where's the shortcomings of Dawkins' worldview? When asked by John Perry Barlow, occasional lyricist for the Grateful Dead, hippie, and New Age cyber prophet, where information is stored, Dawkins replied with, quote, I feel you are trying to get at something which interests you, but doesn't interest me. On the subject of alien life, Dawkins argues that Darwinism applies everywhere in the cosmos, but that life comparable to ours is rare. Dawkins is harsh, not only to religious fundamentalists, but fellow biologists that challenge the paradigm of Darwinism, which I may add is not the same as denying evolution. The genome confirms humans and chimps share 98% of their DNA. The dogma Dawkins claims is that Darwin already fully explained how life came into existence, and that's all there is to it, with some minor footnotes down the line. In some ways, he falls into the same trap of dogmatic religious fundamentalists, that all the explanations for existence can be explained by his field, and that the only possible understanding of reality is, quote, scientific understanding. So what are a few alternative theories to Darwinism? Lynn Margulis of University of Massachusetts at Amherst challenges, quote unquote, ultra-Darwinian orthodoxy by pointing out a few things. Darwinism puts emphasis on competition, hence the term survival of the fittest, while symbiosis may have been just as important, if not more so, to evolution. Symbiosis accounts for starts and stops in the fossil record, why certain species could appear for so long without changing. All life on Earth is in a symbiotic relationship called Gaia, coined by James Lovelock. Stuart Kauffman, biochemist at the Santa Fe Institute, another challenger of Darwin, began testing his ideas in simulations that represented chemical and biological substances. Kauffman argues that anti-chaos may have a more significant role than natural selection in the evolution of life. Life was not created by accident, but a tendency towards order. Kauffman sees both living and non-living entities as mathematical forms. Kauffman argues his view of evolution is more meaningful than Dawkins, but I doubt mathematical abstractions are as appealing as the gaping vagina creation myth. Typically, we credit science for breakthroughs and revolutions such as landing man on the moon, curing diseases, making information, etc. Science is a force of transformation, correct? For the most part, but it also has, like many other human institutions, a tendency to conserve the status quo. This conservatism stems from very high standards in order to be effective. Quantum mechanics and relativity are viable because they predict outcomes so effectively. In science, the life of a theory is determined by its correspondence to reality. The theory of evolution is well supported by fossil records, but the origin of life itself is a bit of a question mark. David Bohm created a philosophy called the Implicat Order, which embraced both science and mysticism. Bohm began to question the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics in the 1940s. Niels Bohr viewed reality as undetermined. Bohm rejected this because the point of science is to discover the phenomenon of reality that explains things. Bohm was opposed to the view of science reducing reality to formulas or controlling things technologically. Bohm also argued that particles are in fact particles at all times, when they are or not observed. The behavior is determined by a force Bohm called the pilot wave. Any effort to measure would physically alter the pilot wave, thus destroying any information about them. This would make the uncertainty principle, which states that the more precisely you measure a particle, the less precise you can measure momentum, and vice versa. A physical rather than metaphysical meaning. David Bohm's philosophy was inspired by an experiment in which an ink drop was rotated in a cylinder of glycerin. The ink would spiral out into chaos, but could be rotated back into a drop of ink. His philosophy of the implicate and explicate order suggests that behind the chaos of our explicate reality, there is a deeper order from which it projects out of. Applying this to the quantum, the implicate order is a field of infinite pilot waves. The overlapping of these waves gives the appearance of what we see as particles, constituting the explicate order. According to Bohm, even space and time could be the explicate manifestations of the implicate order. However, Bohm recognized the limits of projecting a theory of reality onto existence. Quote, "There's no end to this, you see. The very nature of our knowledge is of that nature. But what underlies it all is unknown and cannot be grasped by thought. Science is a never-ending process. Modern physics assumes that the mechanics of nature are all there is to reality. We must ask ourselves why these patterns are there. Atoms, for instance, are not the essence of reality. So we should assume that the forces of nature are the essence of reality. A, quote, final scientific theory of reality would only prevent us from thinking more deeply. Bohm used the metaphor of putting a glass barrier between a fish and the rest of a tank. If the glass is lifted, the fish will think the boundary is there and never question it. Quote, the ability to perceive or think differently is more important than the knowledge granted. Quote, Bohm was desperate to know, to discover the secret of everything, either through physics or through meditation or through mystical knowledge. And yet he insisted that reality was unknowable because, I believe, he was repelled by the thought of finality. He recognized that any truth, no matter how initially wondrous, eventually ossifies into a dead, inanimate thing that does not reveal the absolute, but conceals it. Bohm craved not truth, but revelation, perpetual revelation. As a result, he was doomed to perpetual doubt. So how about cosmology, the Big Bang and all that shit? What is the origin of our universe? When does it begin and when does it end? Which is as difficult as trying to determine the beginning or end of a sphere. Even physicist and cosmologist Stephen Hawking admitted that physics may never find the answer after all. This isn't to say that cosmology hasn't given us significant discoveries. A century ago, it was believed that the Milky Way was the whole universe. Astronomers discovered that nebulae had their own island of stars, and that the Milky Way was only one of many galaxies. Another surprise found by astronomers was the red glow of galaxies. This is caused by their hurtling away from each other, and also supports Einstein's theory of relativity that the universe began as an explosion. Abundance of light abundance of light elements in the Milky Way and microwaves in the background are other pillars that the Big Bang theory stands on. A rival of Hawking is Audrey Lynn. Lynn is credited with refining and winning the theory of inflation, which was created by Alan Guth of MIT. Quote, "When the cosmos was allegedly smaller than a proton, gravity might briefly have become a repulsive rather than an attractive force. As a result, the universe supposedly passed through a tremendous exponential growth spurt before settling down to its current, much more leisure rate of expansion. Although inflation is based on untestable theories of particle physics, it explains why the universe appears the same in all directions." Inflation is self-exhausting. Once inflation begins, it will always continue somewhere. New universes are beginning at every moment. Some inflate too fast, and others immediately collapse. Others, like ours, inflate just right. We are a drop in an infinite cosmic sea. Lynn even goes so far as to suggest that our universe may have even been created by beings in another universe, and that physicists, such as himself, might be decoding the creation of our cosmic parents, but that we are not quite grown up to know. Lynn claims that he doesn't claim to have the answer, but to keep on searching. A lot of physicists like the idea of inflation, but it can't be thoroughly verified because it doesn't make predictions that could be explained in some other way. Scientists don't appreciate discovering infinite things about the universe. By the year 2200, we will have discovered 90% of accessible phenomena. Quote, "The history of most efforts at discovery follows a common pattern. Whether we consider the discovery of varieties of insects, the exploration of the oceans for continents and islands, or the search for oil reserves in the ground. There is an initial accelerating rise in the discovery rate as increasing numbers of explorers become attracted. The search is approaching an end. An occasionally previously overlooked feature can be found or a particular rare species encountered. But the rate of discovery begins to decline quickly and then diminishes to a trickle. Interest drops. Researchers leave the field, and there is virtually no further activity." End quote. John Donne has a quote that would be fitting for the epitaph of Cosmology. Quote, "My thoughts reach all, comprehend all, inexplicable mystery. I, their creator, am in a closed prison, in a sick bed, anywhere in any one of my creatures, my thoughts, is with the sooner, and beyond the sooner, overtakes the sooner, and overgoes the sooner, in one pace, one step, everywhere." Well, if space isn't the final frontier for science, then what is? The mind is a source of endless questions, such as what is awareness and why are we conscious? See my previous video. For most of the 20th century, these seem to be more like metaphysical questions than scientific. The consensus among neuroscientists is that properties of the mind are not dependent on quantum mechanics. Quote, "Philosophically inclined physicists would argue that the act of measurement, and hence consciousness itself, played a vital role in determining the outcome of experiments involving quantum effects. Proponents of this often have philosophical or religious motives." Christoph Koch summed up this position in the following syllogism: "Quantum mechanics is mysterious. Consciousness is mysterious. And therefore, they must be related." Deconstructing what the mind and consciousness is will be particularly relevant for all the incels that want a realistic waifu sex bot. Arthur Penrose, mathematician and philosopher of science, argues that computers will not be capable of replicating consciousness. I guess that means we're stuck with the uncanny valley sex bots for the foreseeable future. Penrose believes we don't have consciousness mapped out because of Gödel's incompleteness theorem. The human brain is more complex than anything we currently have a model of. Consciousness cannot be explained by the current laws of physics. How do we know that anything is conscious, be it you or me, or the ground I'm standing on, or the camera that's recording right now, etc.? David Chalmers, Australian philosopher, argues that physical explanations of consciousness only account for function, such as memory or attention, but does not account for subjective experience. There is no information without an information processor. The mind-body problem is not one that science can solve, but maybe philosophy can. Horgan concludes this chapter with, quote, "Human science or not, human science cannot solve the how do I know you're conscious problem. But if AI does become fully conscious at some point, we will be the ones making sandwiches for them." Horgan describes a mystical experience where objectively he was just lying on his lawn, but his awareness was in a dark limbo where he was both astonished and terrified of existence. He felt as if he was the only conscious being in the universe, but then experienced an infinity of selves. The experience terrified him, and it took some time to make sense of it, for fear of becoming totally insane. Horgan found that the omega point was useful for making metaphorical sense of his experience. Quote, "It is considered bad form to imagine being God, but one can imagine being an immensely powerful computer that pervades, that is the entire universe. As the mega point approaches the final collapse of time and space and being itself, it will undergo a mystical experience. It will recognize with ever greater force the utter implausibility of its existence. It will realize that there is no creator, no God, other than itself. It exists and nothing else. The omega point must also realize that its lust for final knowledge and unification has brought it to the brink of eternal nothingness, and that if it dies, everything dies. Being itself will vanish. The omega point's terrified recognition of its plight will compel it to flee from itself, from its own awful aloneness and self-knowledge. Creation, with all its pain and beauty and multiplicity, stems from, or is, the desperate, terrified flight of the omega point from itself. Intellectual questioning of the nature of existence won't cease, because that would mean oblivion. The philosopher Zenas Clark observed that ordinary philosophy is much like a dog chasing its own tail. Real philosophy is when we remain in our destination. The answer to all the mysteries of the universe is that there is no answer, but a question. Quote, "The world is a riddle that God has created in order to shield himself from his terrible solitude and fear of death." That concludes today's episode. It is a synopsis of The End of Science by John Horgan. As you can see, the past few videos this month have had the theme of materialism, consciousness, science, if science can solve these questions. But we will be back on our usual topics of philosophy and spirituality. But I would like to examine science and a few of these other topics in the future. So if you have any resources or recommendations for that in the future, you are welcome to post that then in the comments. I am Parker Thibault of Focus Shift Media. You are more than welcome to check out our other work on the channel, as well as our website, and to stay tuned on our newsletter. Have a good week.